from our panel, which is entitled Remedies for a Labor Market in Distress. We certainly know from Larry's talk that indeed it is a labor market in distress, and the question is, how do we get out of it? And we will have 4 panelists. One panelist is en route. I think he's been delayed due to travel problems, but he will be joining us, and we'll fit him in as appropriate. Starting from my immediate left, we have Mark Levinson, who is the chief economist at SEIU. His full bio, as for the other panels, can be found in your packets. Arne Kalleberg is a professor of labor sociology and public policy at the University of North Carolina, and they will speak in the order in which I'm introducing them. And the third person, who is next to the empty seat, is Laura Fortman, the executive director of the Francis Perkins Center and a former labor commissioner of Maine. Those of you who were at last night's dinner know that Francis Perkins was not just a Secretary of Labor, but a major proponent of the social insurance program that we now know today. So that's quite an honor to be heading up that center, I'm sure. And our final speaker will be Robert Hockett, who is a professor of law at Cornell Law School. Okay, we'll have time for questions afterwards. So if you've got some questions as we go along, just jot them down so you'll have your coherent question at the end of the session.
Is that? Oh. I'm really going to, I think, illustrate some of the themes and points Larry talked about. I want to take a step back, and I'm not going to be making specific proposals or specific programs to deal with this crisis, but highlighting some of the economic arguments behind the necessity or the call for a much, much larger government response to this crisis. Doesn't seem to be. One obvious thing that I think haunts us at this moment is, given the kind of crisis that we've experienced, it's usually after a crisis like this that some kind of significant change occurs. Milton Friedman argued this in the 70s. There was this new receptivity to his arguments that in the 80s as a result of the crisis in the 70s, obviously after the crisis in the 30s, the New Deal era was a response. And one of the questions is what is going to happen this time? And I think this doesn't seem to. Oh, okay. So just quickly, Larry hit on a lot of these points. I'm just going to, there's, obviously massive unemployment. We have almost 24 million workers who can't find full-time work. Is it? As Larry pointed out, there's the unemployment problem is much worse than the monthly figures indicate. If you look at the number of people who experience unemployment over the course of the year, and this is, this extends throughout the society. Recent college graduates are experiencing extremely high unemployment. To put our current situation in some context, some of you may be familiar with this graph from gets a lot of circulation on the internet. It comes from calculated risk. There's always a slide in a PowerPoint where the presenter says, look at that. It's all you need to know. And people look at it and say, what the hell is that? But it's actually very interesting. What this is every post-war recession through the early 90s. And actually, that last line wasn't supposed to be there. This is every post-war recession through the 80s. And, it shows the length of the recession, and it shows the amount of job loss, and it shows the recovery, the speed of the recovery, it shows how long it takes to get to the pre-recession level of jobs. Notice this characteristic: the recessions are of different length, different severity. They all have a V-shaped kind of serious recession followed by a steep recovery. This is the kind of classic business cycle that we used to learn about in graduate school. Things start to change in the early 90s. Oops. Now this works like so good. It can't. The early 90s, you notice the Clinton recession, actually quite shallow recession, and yet it takes a long time for jobs to come back. The phenomenon of what at the time we started to hear about the jobless recovery. The recession is not V-shaped. And by the way, this recession wasn't caused by rising interest rates, and it wasn't solved by falling interest rates. Something new is on the horizon here. The George Bush recession, same thing. Actually kind of a shallow recession. Takes an even longer time for jobs to come back. The nature of the business cycle seems to be changing. And now you look at the current recession, the mother of all recessions. Much worse, much longer, much deeper than any recession in the post-war period, but also starting to demonstrating the same characteristics of the last two recessions. Very slow recovery. And part of this is the cause of this recession was different, and the nature of the recovery is different. I'm going to come back to this later. Larry talked about the employment population. I mean, despite the recovery, the employment population ratio is stuck at extremely low level, highlighting the nature of this crisis. And these numbers often don't capture what's going on. Another way to look at this, since January 2000, the population of the United States has increased by 32 million people. In that same period, the number of jobs has increased by 1,119. That's the reality of a stagnant employment to population ratio. I mean, there's a massive employment problem in this society, and happy talk about a recovery and so on doesn't capture what's going on. Now, just a few slides on the kind of macroeconomics of this. This is basically the components of aggregate demand. Residential investment way down, obviously, as a result from the housing crisis. This is what normally leads recoveries. It's very low. Business investment is very weak. Personal consumption actually is kind of flat. And the increase in government expenditure doesn't begin to make up for the gap. Another way to look at this, just historically, what's interesting about this shows the relationship between essentially government debt and private debt. Notice historically there's essentially a symmetrical relationship between the two. That symmetry breaks down in the most recent experience, where the decline, decline in private debt of about 12% is not made up by an increase in public debt of about 8% of GDP. And so in kind of macroeconomic terms, that right there is the gap in our economy. And of course, there's been this comes from the recent McKinsey report on deleveraging. Private sector households are still deleveraging. Demand is weak, according to McKinsey. Just extrapolating these trends, it's not till middle or end of 2013 that we can expect private deleveraging to get back to the trend. All of this calls out. There's no demand in this economy. There is only one sector capable of filling that role, and that is the government. This is the problem what Larry alluded to. This is a very important graph. I find this staggering. Just quickly, because we don't have a lot of time. What this shows is the effect of fiscal policy on the economy. Fiscal policy including all levels of government, federal, state, and local. The black line is kind of putting the federal, state, and local together. What this shows is right now, with this staggering employment problem, the federal government is slowing the economy. Fiscal policy is contractionary at the moment. This is staggering. This is ridiculous. This is unbelievable. This is the reality. I mean, it shows, at the height of the stimulus, but the government is slowing the economy. And it could get worse. And by the way, this line, they assume the automatic spending cuts don't go into effect. I don't know why they assume that, but because I think they are going to go. But so it could be much, much, much worse than this. On the relationship of debt, and I think there's huge misunderstandings about this. The top chart, which basically is the federal debt to GDP ratio, it shows it's starting to rise. It's still, by historic standards, but if you extrapolate that out to 2012, it's rising. Still much lower than it was in the post-World War II era, where we were able to achieve decades of economic growth, but it's rising. But look at the bottom chart, which shows interest payments as a percent of federal outlays. The interest burden is at historic lows. It's because interest rates are so low. People are lending the U.S. government and losing money, giving the U.S. government money, and we should be spending that money and creating jobs. That it's not happening it's criminal. The policy failure here, which is of course backed by a political failure, is staggering. Despite these failures, and just harking back to the first thing about the result of crisis, there could be. The question is, what kind of change is this crisis going to lead to? We seek a certain kind of change, but things could get even worse. And Charles Koch is, pledging that the 2012 election is going to be the most important election of our lifetimes. And some of you may be, you're all aware of how much politics has changed, but this quote from Eisenhower that should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws, you would not hear that party again in our political history. There's a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. And they certainly dominate the Republican Party at the moment, but it's a sign of how far politics has shifted to the right. I want to end with the importance of these policy questions. This is a graph. There's no title on it yet because what could this graph be? Could be, this is the 2000s. It could be inequality. It could be housing prices. But no. What this is the... Now, but it's really kind of outrageous and illustrates, I think, the arrogance of the policy mistakes that led to this incredible situation we're in. And, as people here know, it's really not very funny. This has led to monumental historic problems. And I think the policy community, that was so, I don't mean people in this room, I mean the mainstream policy community that believed you could have a sustainable economy with growing inequality and stagnant wages and huge trade deficits and this was the new economy. I don't think a full accounting has taken place yet, and I'm honored to be here amongst people who are actively seeking an alternative. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Larry and Mark have outlined the dire circumstances we're in, and that's helpful to set up what I'm going to talk about, which is to suggest perhaps some ways of thinking about strategies for addressing some of these issues. I would summarize what Larry and Mark have said by saying that employment relations have become increasingly precarious in the United States since the mid-1970s. And by precarious, I mean work that is uncertain, insecure, and in which the risks are borne by the individual workers rather than by their employers or by the government. This affects everybody, not just temporary workers, not just the unemployed, but full-time people who think they have relatively secure jobs are also precarious. And the anxiety associated with this has had enormous consequences. Now, the idea of precarious work is not new. It has existed since the beginning of paid employment. However, since the mid-1970s, the forces of globalization, technological change, changes in deregulation or re-regulation of markets and so on, have really shifted the balance of power between employers and their employees. And I would argue that the situation we find ourselves in now with this precariousness is not a temporary fluctuation of the business cycles. It's a structural transformation of the economy. And I don't mean structural unemployment. I mean a fundamental shift in power relations which has fundamentally altered the rules of the game. And so accompanying this increase in precarity has been the abandonment of the social contract that was established during the New Deal and characterized the 3 decades after World War II. And employers and the government have abandoned their obligations to workers. And so what we need now is a new social contract that will address these issues. Now, a new social contract has got to be sensitive to the conditions that led to the transformations of employment relations in the first place. We can't do the New Deal again. For example, the globalization has produced a fundamental restructuring of jobs throughout the world. Technological changes have led to enormous changes, and so on. Now, all countries of the world are facing this problem. All industrial countries, be they in Europe, be they in Latin America, be they in Asia or Africa, are facing this problem. The problem is how to balance the need for flexibility on the part of states and employers to deal with this global competition, and at the same time trying to provide some sort of security for the workers who are who have to deal with this flexibility. Now, as I look around the world, a model or a narrative that is appealing to me to address this issue is the concept of flexicurity. Now, flexicurity, in a narrow sense, has been identified with Danish and Dutch labor models, But the concept is quite broad, it seems to me. It's a set of meta-policies, not a policy. And it basically argues that labor market institutions do matter in addressing these kinds of issues. It does provide the possibility of a win-win situation, though who wins more is a matter of debate. And it is an appealing concept to think about new ways of looking at the changing nature of employment relationships. Now, the thing with flexicurity is that it's very important that it would be customized to particular national characteristics. And so what we need here is a flexicurity with an American face. Now, in the United States, and by the way, I should mention that flexicurity, that portmanteau word, really means flexibility for employers and the state and security for workers. Now, in the United States, employers have plenty of flexibility. So we really don't need that as the first priority. We need to protect that. I would argue that moving forward toward this new social contract requires a recognition of the employer's need for flexibility, but the real challenge is to provide workers with more security. And I have three foci of this new social contract, three kinds of security. The first, and probably the most important in some ways, is economic security. Workers need economic security to protect them from the consequences of precarious work. A study by the International Labor Organization of hundreds of countries was done during the late 1990s, placed the U.S. 23rd out of 96 countries on indicators of economic security. Now, clearly, and this is very much to the topic of this group, social insurance is the common solution to problems of high risk and the problems of economic security. And so what we need, and this is not anything new, but we need to give people the self-confidence to take entrepreneurial risks. We need them to have the confidence to stay out of the labor market until they can get better jobs. And so what I'm talking about are things like portable health benefits, generous retirement benefits that are more portable, and expanded unemployment benefits and wage supports that would enable people to transition to better jobs in the new market. So that's the bedrock of any new social contract, the idea of economic security. A second pillar is the idea of representation security. A new social contract needs to provide workers with the rights to collective bargaining and bargaining power without specifying the form of that bargaining power. Now, the U.S. ranked very low on this by international standards. The ILO index had it 41 out of 99 countries. Traditionally, unions in the United States have been based on this workplace model, and that, however, needs to be rethought in face of the fact that workers are no longer attached to their employers to the extent that they used to be. We live in an age of precarity, and worker representation needs to recognize that. And finally, the third pillar of the new social contract is skill reproduction security. By that I mean a new social contract needs to focus on training and retraining workers for new jobs. Now, internationally, the U.S. Ranks pretty high on this. We ranked 12th out of 138 countries on the ILO's index. However, a great more deal needs to be done, and especially it needs to be done because of the enormous changes that are occurring in the labor market. I can't overemphasize the importance of education and job-related training. Larry said that this is an issue every year. I can understand why. It's essential. And we need to recognize not only the preparatory and post-secondary education, but also the lifelong learning, which is going to be essential in the new economy. Now, if we can focus, if we can move toward these three forms of security, then it seems to me that we are going to lead to a situation where better jobs will be created. If people are more economically secure, if they have representation, if they have ability to be retrained, then they are more likely to be innovative in entrepreneurial activity. Businesses are more likely to be incentivized to create jobs that will make use of these abilities. Also, these kinds of security are likely to facilitate the acquisition of other forms of security. For example, if workers have representation security, they are able to enjoy better occupational health and safety. If they have economic and skill security, then they shouldn't worry so much about losing their jobs. We don't need as many protections against layoffs because in a rapidly changing market, layoffs are to be expected, and the key is to bring people back into the labor market after they're unemployed. So, for example, Denmark is the quintessential example of a country in which employer protections, people can get fired at any time, but they can get back into the labor market. Okay, I think we all agree on these things. How do we implement them? Well, I would argue that we need a coordinated effort among government, business, and labor in order to implement this new social contract. Now, there are many obstacles to this, and Larry, I think, elaborated many of the obstacles to this. We have ideological disagreements about the role of the government and what its role should be in the economy. We have this trust in markets to solve problems. We have a lack of trust in government, business, unions, and institutions in general. The labor movement is weak relative to what it used to be. We have a deficit. We have concerns with a lot of things. And we have this attitude that people are not, that people should deal with problems on their own, an ideological theme that has existed since the late 70s at least. Now, I think the idea of flexicurity, though, does offer a narrative that provides a counter-narrative to arguments that either the government should do everything or we should let markets do them. But each of the three key actors have important roles to play. The government has an important role to play, and the experience of other countries underscores the importance of the government for a commitment to a good life and a good society. The government is something to be used in the public interest. And so the government should provide things like economic security, a strong infrastructure, and opportunities for people to succeed. It should provide a safety net, should set standards in markets, and play a major role in education and training. Business, however, also has an important role to play. Business has enormous discretion in terms of how they design jobs. Some businesses take the high road to create jobs that utilize skilled human capital. Others try to only cut costs. So it seems to me that business has an important role to play, and one way to get business incentivized to do this is for groups of employers to act together to ensure to share the risks of providing investments, for example, in things like job training. And finally, labor has an important role to play. The key question, as far as I'm concerned, is what kinds of worker power are best suited to this changing nature of the employment relationship? The workplace model of organization may have been more effective in the past. Now we need to have unions and other forms of worker power help workers cope with their inter-firm mobility and their portability. And one important way of doing this, given that we're in a service economy, is linking worker movements to other social movements that might bring the consumer in and therefore put pressure on employers to act in certain ways. What are some strategies for implementing the new social contract? Well, just briefly, public-private partnerships strike me as a great idea. In North Carolina, where I live, we've got a number of public partnerships between community colleges and private businesses in various local communities. The biotechnology industry is one example. We need to have local experiments, and this is an opportunity, just as what happened during the New Deal, where a number of states experimented with unemployment insurance and various other protections that became ended up in the federal New Deal legislation, so too we have opportunities. One of the lessons of the flexicurity model is that things happen at the local level. And so we have examples like Washington and New Jersey joining California in adopting the first paid family leave programs in the United States. Massachusetts experimented with universal health coverage. We also need national actions, because if we have only local actions, then companies can venue shop and go to the states with the lowest regulations. And here, what we really need, it seems to me, is one good, I think one idea that appeals to me is the idea of institutional layering, to take existing policies, for example, the trade assistance, the trade adjustment assistance, the TAA, which has been targeted to manufacturing companies that lose jobs due to foreign competition. Why not extend that to, because it's very hard to know whether or not you've lost your job due to foreign competition or not. Why not extend it to the service sector and to people who have become precarious for other reasons as well? And finally, we need global solutions. We need labor standards. We need to avoid a race to the bottom. So all of these things in concert, it seems to me, have a possibility and are an attractive narrative to addressing the issues of precarity. And I would also argue that if we were able to enact these three pillars of the new social contract, we will also address many of the other broader concerns about the economy working again. Thank you.
Okay, this falls into the wow category. I don't have any snazzy slides, and the vision that Arne laid out is majestic. It's huge. And what I'm hopefully going to be adding to the conversation today is, what does it feel like when you're in the state and you have to try to deal with, on the ground, thousands of people who are unemployed? Before I get to that, though, I need to start with my touchstone, who is Frances Perkins. And when I was thinking about this, it was like, well, what was going on with Frances Perkins in the depths of the Great Depression? And I came across a flyer that she did. We've spent a lot of time talking today about messaging, about can you get things down on one page? And I figured if Frances Perkins could get it down on one page, somehow all of this we need to be able to figure out. And so she did a flyer talking about the importance of social insurance that was titled Dark Spots in Our Social Life. And the first paragraph of that says, unemployment, sickness, accident, death, and old age manifest themselves in terrible individual experiences and create social conditions which call for immediate solution. Our social responsibility is great. Material distress and deterioration of human values grow at a greater pace than the preventative measures we take. Most European countries have nationwide unemployment insurance, medical care provisions, and other forms of social insurance. We in America are yet too involved in discussion, in comparison of different methods, in speculating on possible outcomes when reality calls for action. And as I think about the situation that we've been facing since we plunged into the Great Recession, those words echoed with me as a former labor commissioner, that the systems we had in place were created back in the Great Recession. Some of the systems were a little creaky, needed a little tuning, but they prevented people plunging into poverty. And when Larry was talking about when he was saying, and the economy started to crash, and it happened very, very rapidly in 2007. In the States, it started really hitting us in 2008, and it was dramatic. It felt like a free fall that we had. I'll use my state of Maine as an example. It's a small state. It's a rural state. You've heard lots of conversation about things being a little bit different in rural states. We only have 1.3 million people. So it should be a manageable issue. For those 1.3 million people, I had 21.5 staff people handling unemployment insurance. When you have 5% unemployment insurance, that's manageable. When you almost overnight start seeing that skyrocket to 7.5%, and it just is trying to ramp up is practically impossible. And we were a tiny microcosm of what was happening at every Department of Labor across this country, of systems that were in place. And by systems, I mean the technology that was in place and expected to gear up and provide these essential safety net programs. You didn't have the people, and you did not have the technology to turn around and get those checks out in a timely manner that complied with all of the regulations that are essential for it to be there. When the stimulus happened, all of us were ecstatic because that is desperately what was needed. And what that really did was it put a halt to the free fall. You had, Arne, you were talking about building onto TAA programs. The stimulus did that. It expanded the Trade Act to pick up coverage for service sector, for government. So it started providing some of those essential expansions. It put an extra $25 into everyone's pocket who was collecting unemployment. And that money, as all of you know, it was immediately turned around and used in the local economy to help stabilize, because unemployment insurance provides not only immediate income support for the family, but also for the communities. And because in small rural places, when you saw large plant closings, for us, we lost lots of paper maker jobs, which were primarily located in isolated areas of the state. Those were good paying jobs where someone who worked there could, had a nice middle class life and income. They could have a decent truck and a snowmobile and, take a vacation. And when those jobs were lost, it was not only those workers, but the entire community was decimated because the local grocery store depended on the folks from the mill shopping at those stores. So you started seeing the hollowing out of basic communities. So the Stimulus Act did much for us. However, there was total mismessaging. There was this sense out there that it hadn't done anything. It was a failure. Why do you need to extend any of these programs? When the reality is we should have been claiming victory and promoting the good things that were happening. There was the beginning of creativity that was happening, but it wasn't coordinated, championed, and shouted the way that it appears that some of the other programs in previous times were able to get that organized public support, because people did not understand what was happening, and they also did not, there was incredible fear out there. I met with thousands of workers in Maine. We would do rapid response sessions where you would come in, meet with laid off workers, and try to explain some basic safety net programs to them so that they could, and then try to help them figure out how to access those programs. Every worker I met with, the first question, so let's start talking about like 2007, 2008. First question every single worker asked me was, can you get me another job? That was it. First question. If you can't get me a job, am I eligible for unemployment insurance? And then the answer to that wasn't, of course you are. It was, it depends, which is not a good answer to someone who has just lost their job. But It does. It depends. It depends on your earnings. It depends on, in a layoff situation, they would have met the qualifications of hopefully being eligible because they had lost their job through no fault of their own. But so you explain how to apply for an insurance. You explain that there's a waiting week. Then the third question they asked, and Jim, in Maine, we weren't quite as lucky as in some other states. The next question was health insurance. What do I do about my health insurance? Because that's connected to your employment. You lose your job, you lose your health insurance. One of the things that the stimulus package did include was a subsidy, a 65% subsidy toward COBRA. But a 65% towards 102% of what your health care costs when you're only getting a small amount of money, in many cases, was not enough to make health insurance affordable. So you don't have your health insurance, or you're terrified about how do you keep providing your medication for your sick or ill spouse. Then the fourth thing that they started, and as the recession went on, this question got bumped up further, was what about retraining? You know, is there something out there? Because we had all heard and believed to a certain degree a little bit about the skill mismatch. If I'm a paper maker, chances are I'm not going to get another paper making job. So is there something else I should be paying attention to, particularly if I'm in my early 40s compared to if I'm in my mid to late 50s? And then where are those jobs? And then how do I pay for those jobs? One of the things that did happen during the stimulus was a push by the president to encourage people to go back to school. And the states were asked to get that message out to people who were unemployed, to encourage them to go back to school. There was no additional money for that. What it was you were encouraged to partner with the unemployment insurance program to continue to provide some benefits while someone was going to school, which was fine. But it wasn't necessarily easy to make that happen. We sent out letters to everyone who was unemployed saying, you know, come in to the career centers. The other thing that I think you need to recognize is that employment insurance and employment services and unemployment insurance programs at one point had been in the same space or next to each other. In the 90s, as an efficiency measure, unemployment insurance in most states in the country went to primarily a call center environment. In many ways, that was very helpful. It was easier to get information out. You needed fewer staff people. But what happened when the recession hit was people who vaguely knew that unemployment insurance existed did not know where to go. They were looking for the unemployment office. The unemployment office had ceased to exist in most places back in the 90s. It was a phone number that you needed to call in. So you had unemployed people looking for employment. They would show up at career centers, which were the employment centers, asking to figure out how to get unemployment benefits, which the poor staff at the career centers couldn't help them with. So you had heightened frustration. You also had no place, they weren't visible. There was an invisibility about those thousands of unemployed workers. You did not see long lines of people wrapped around blocks, for the most part, who were unemployed. And I think that lack of visibility also hurt with highlighting the desperate need that was out there and is still out there. People are incredibly resilient, they're creative, and they want to work. And it's figuring out how to provide the appropriate support package to folks as they're struggling with this, and to help with those jobs. Because that is what every single unemployed worker was looking for, was a job and a paycheck that would help them support themselves and their families. There were enormous challenges, and I think part of it that was also a challenge was the demonization of state employees, that it is extremely difficult to provide quality services when you're being demonized in the press. And it's a system that was under stress, that there are good ideas out there for how can we ramp up basic safety net programs. We're having lots of conversations about social insurance here today. I'm not going to get into the UI trust fund solvency issues and challenges, but that was another thing going into the recession. Most states were not prepared with a solvent trust fund. And then once the trust funds started having the demand on it, the way that people, there was an argument against increasing taxes on employers during a recession, and so the other alternative is reducing benefits. And what we're starting to see now in states across the country is an effort to reduce benefits, to do things like drug testing, a shifting of blaming unemployed workers for the situation that they're in because of the economy. So I think we do get back to that values conversation about what is our responsibility as a nation to workers, and how do we fulfill that obligation. I think that they're reframing the message is one thing, so we can't demonize unemployed workers. We're starting to hear those workers being termed as being, lazy, and if they just got out there and tried looking harder. So there's an increase on work search requirements when we heard Larry and others talk about the fact that, there are 4 people looking for every single job. It's not that people aren't out there looking. The jobs are not there for them. And I think that anything that the Fed is doing to help states, we really need to be having conversations about making sure that any federal assistance to the states, there's also a promise that benefits not be cut for workers as we're going through that. And then how can we do things like work share? Are there other strategies that we can be using to help people? And I think I'll just kind of try to wrap up here because I'm interested in the conversation. But I do want to end it with the values, again, bringing us back to values with another Frances Perkins quote, and it's about the New Deal. And she said, "What was the New Deal anyhow? Was it a political plot? Was it just a name for a period in history? Was it a revolution? To all of these things, I answer no. It was something quite different. It was, I think, basically an attitude that found voice in expressions like, the people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life."
I don't believe Robert Hockett has stuck in the room without us knowing it. So we're going to move to sort of the question discussion period right now. I would just mention that Professor Hockett was going to pick up on one of the strategies that Larry Michel mentioned in his talk, and that's public infrastructure investment and how it could help the economy in a number of ways. It's based on one section of a New America Foundation report that he co-authored called The Way Forward, Moving from the Post-Bubble, Post-Bust Economy to Renewed Growth and Competition. I think they may try to fit him in somewhere else in this afternoon's program, should he arrive in a timely manner, a revised timely manner. Let's shift now to the discussion period, the question period again. There are mics on either side of the room, and if you have a question and cannot get to a microphone, there is a roving mic back here. So wave your hand, and somebody will come over and get you plugged in, so to speak. While we're waiting for people to get to the mic, I see 2 people already. But let me just ask a question that may or may not be on other people's minds. We've had several mentions about how to change the safety net to be more responsive to the current environment. And I'd like maybe Arne could start off in talking about some of the flex security kinds of things that deal with safety net. Could you kind of start us off on that conversation?
Well, I mean, provision of economic security would be the key aspect to the reconstituting the safety net. How we get there is the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Do you have are there specific programs perhaps in European countries that differ from ours that you might recommend us picking up on? Well,
the two models, the two exemplars are Denmark and the Netherlands. Both of these are very small, homogeneous countries, obviously, and so it's not going to be totally portable here. But in Denmark, I really like the active labor market policies that provide workers with a channel, a pathway back into jobs once they've become unemployed. But this kind of flex security model is also being tried in Japan and other countries as well. So it's pretty broad. But it has to be, the key thing about it is that it has to be, it's not really a policy, it's a meta policy. So it has to be applied to the situation in the country. So I think what flex security does is give us goals. It gives us ideas for strategies. And then forces us to identify how it should be applied into our own situation.
Laura, do you want to add on to that by any chance?
No, I think the other thing that has to happen if we're going to get there, because when I was commissioner, I had heard about this flex security thing, and it's like, what can we do? We need to do something. So there needs to be that, we heard last night when Michael was giving his keynote, he was talking about how during the New Deal you had the academics coming together with policy people, with folks who actually implemented programs on the ground. And I think that there needs to be that sort of coming together so that you have the implementation strategy there, because you can have all the brilliant ideas you want. If you can't make them work on the ground, it's problematic. So I would say that we should be exploring those conversations more across disciplines and moving forward an agenda that meets some of those goals.
Mark, do you want to add?
Just, one thing that strikes me, not exactly income security, but related to employment security. One thing that stands out in this crisis, given the extent of the unemployment problem, is the utter lack of any discussion of the government employing people. Mm-hmm. If this week, I don't know if some of you have seen the infamous 57-page memo from Larry Summers to the new president-elect, which kind of in a way defined the economic policy administration early on. It's really a fascinating document that you should all read, because he's kind of laying out the options there. And this is in the midst of the crisis, and they raise this issue about it's actually hard to spend the kind of money we need to spend quickly and get people employed. And this was part of the argument for the tax cuts and the aid to states and cities was, we got to get all this money out there, quickly. But at the same time, we got to, figure out a way to employ people and infrastructure spending, which is really needed, but it's kind of slow. And there's this whole discussion. There is not a mention. There is not a word. It's not like they considered it and then rejected it. There's not a mention of the government actually employing people. And we raised this numerous times in administration, that there were all kinds of workable models in the past, as recently as under the Carter administration. And there were ways to do this in a new way. There's a kind of social service caregiving need that, could have been filled by public employment that wasn't even considered. And it just is kind of striking to me, the retreat of government's imagination in responding to this crisis.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Sharon Lacey. I work for Bedrock Capital Management in Los Altos, California. And I'm kind of curious. Most of the people that I know, most of the people I work with have probably exceeded the cap most of their career. But a lot of those people are now unemployed. There's been significant layoffs in Silicon Valley. And they're having a hard time getting jobs because they're perceived to be too old or they're overqualified. I have a friend who's actually taking a job now for $30,000 a year because he doesn't want to be bored, but he keeps getting rejected. And I just am curious about these unemployment numbers. How many of those people are actually people at the higher end that are unable to get work because of those reasons, and how real that is? Thank you.
The answer is very. I think, and again, I would defer to a labor market information person, but what we saw, and I think it was probably true across the country, was that this recession hit every demographic category. As we heard Larry talking about, that you have college graduates who are unemployed now, although at lower rates of about 5% compared to the rest of the population. But this is something that has hit people of all ages. There are people who are hit harder by it. But then the question that you raised about the older workers was something that we were seeing as well. There was it's a huge challenge, particularly if the only answer anyone has is get additional training. That answer is not particularly useful to someone who's 55, 57, too young for Social Security, and not really interested necessarily in taking on a brand new career. So having something that helps support folks in that area. And perhaps, Arne, I don't know if there was any conversation, because you talked about entrepreneurship. We're hearing a lot about encore careers. Part of the challenge is because our health insurance is linked to our employment. It is very difficult for someone who is, I forget where the woman is, but your friends are talented and have lots of experience. They may want to strike out on their own and do something. But I don't know if health insurance is one of those big challenges for them as well, and they're relying on their employer to pick up that cost. But somehow figuring out a comprehensive package that gives them some flexibility.
Okay. Well, and a shameless plug for the Urban Institute. We do have a program on older workers that might provide some additional insights into that issue. Christine?
Christine Quino, National Academy of Social Insurance. So yesterday, one of the morning panelists observed that large employers spend far less resources skilling their own workers nowadays than compared to a few decades ago, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. So this kind of gets to what you, Arne, was pointing out about the importance of education, lifelong learning, retraining, and everybody loves this idea that, we need to retrain their workers and that solves all the problems. But considering that employers aren't spending the resources to skill their own workers, and then if you look across at the education policy community, they're working their butts off, but they still don't have good, they're still scratching their heads as to how we educate a population. How do we, it's a good idea, but do you guys have any thoughts on where are we going?
Well, you are right. Large employers in particular are spending less on training now than they used to be. It's probably a rational response to the increased portability and movement of people among organizations and the decline of internal labor markets, and the view that why train people when they're going to leave. So that's why I'm thinking these public-private partnerships might be a good way to go, where The training is done by the community college, but there's a real targeted training that would provide real jobs for these folks. So that would remove the training burden from the employer, but it would also provide the products of the community colleges with a place to go after they're trained.
Right. Because employers still complain that we can't find the kinds of workers we need, but everyone's like, I'll work for anything, I'll intern for free, and but I don't know. I guess I'm still skeptical that we're heading in that direction of holding hands and moving forward.
Well, I think just to pick up on this point of community colleges, one of the issues that we would have to face is that if we wanted to go very far down this road, we'd have to think about capacity issues in terms of whether the community colleges or some structure similar to that it is sufficiently prevalent to handle the volume of retraining that we would need. So that kind of suggests we have a two-tier policy issue to deal with, at least 2 tiers.
There are some examples of groups of employers banding, like with the Wisconsin Regional Training up in Milwaukee, where they have groups of employers get together and they promote skill standards and training that is then portable across the firms in that group. So this is probably more of a local kind of a strategy.
There are also some examples with community colleges that are working with businesses and there's some Labor Department demonstrations that address some of this, but the capacity issue is still there. Tony.
Yes, Tony Sarmiento with Senior Service America. It's been a wonderful panel and I think the question, I had a lot of questions, but I just want to make a couple points and also ask a question. First of all, when we think about older workers, we get a grant from the Labor Department, which is part of the Senior Community Service Employment Program under the Older Americans Act. And the Congressional Research Service has described it in 2006 as the last of the public sector employment programs since CETA. So it creates minimum wage jobs, part-time minimum wage jobs in the public sector for low-income older people. It's been around since '68. And it seems to me that when we think about older workers, some of you may have seen the story in the Wall Street Journal recently about people 75 and older who have had to go back to work. And it seems to me a lot of the discussion that we have, which I would argue is still pretty incremental, and we're still sort of stuck in the pilots and demo kind of discussion as opposed to the large-scale efforts that are going to be needed to deal with the numbers that Mark has described. It seems to me if we look at just one segment of older workers, that is those with less income and less education, who, yes, if you look at all older workers, their unemployment rate is lower than for the general population. But if you look at those with less income and less education, their unemployment rate is 3 times higher. And if you fast forward and you think about some of the comments that Laura made about the changes in the public workforce system, where even if it was hard to find out about unemployment insurance, it's now even equally hard for an older worker who may not be as savvy in using computers to even look for and apply for jobs. It seems to me the conclusion that an older worker may feel when it comes to if they don't have enough, either because they're ineligible for Social Security or their Social Security isn't sufficient. It just reminds me of the old headline from the New York City bailout, where Ford to New York City dropped dead. I think that is the message that for many older people, that is the message that our country is saying to them. We're not giving them any assistance to help find work, and we're certainly cutting back on and threatening whatever little social safety net there is. So it seems to me, how do we frame a perhaps revised human capital theory that makes the case that we need to invest in older people at, let's say, 55 and over, which perhaps used to be an older worker, but in many ways they may have 20 more years ahead in the workforce.
Yeah, I think your points, Tony, for those of you who aren't familiar with the structure, when I said career centers, they're called career one-stops. They have different names in different places. But again, it was a cost-saving measure. It was two things. One, it was to try to have all of the services that a worker or a business, you have dual customers, would need in one location. But in most states, the resources aren't there to have one in every community. So particularly in rural areas, without funding for basic infrastructure, these centers never had dedicated resources for administrative purposes. So as money was shrinking, in an attempt to keep any training dollars available to provide actual training, the physical bricks and mortar started disappearing, so many services are only available online. And if you are not comfortable with technology, you're absolutely right. It is incredibly difficult to access the services, even if there are services there for you. And I don't have an answer, but I think you're right. We're not talking about, even though I had said 55, 57 as an older worker, I'm thinking of my paper makers. But there are many, many people working into their 70s now, and I'm not sure what the answer is. So I hope that the project that you referenced has figured that out, Margaret.
Oh, not yet, but I'm sure they're working on it. Next question.
Joan Entmacher, National Women's Law Center. I wanted to get your reactions to fighting back against, what I see as really a very explicit challenge to unemployment insurance as a social insurance program, and really an attempt to turn it into a welfare program. And we know what's happened to temporary assistance to needy families as a safety net program over the last 15 years. There were encouraging signs during the Recovery Act, not only the improvements that you talked about, Laura, but actually incentive funds for states to fix very long-standing gaps in the UI safety net for low-wage workers, making sure their recent work was counted, extending benefits to people who were seeking part-time work, people who had left the workforce for family-related reasons, obviously benefits that were incredibly important to women, providing funding through training and dependence benefits, incentives for states that enacted those reforms. And 38 states took advantage of the money that was on the table to improve their UI systems. But now we not only see an effort to cut back on the emergency benefits, but federal legislation that would put up new barriers in the core program, saying that you have to have a high school diploma or a GED, or be studying for a GED, even though there are no places where you can do that, and getting a GED is hardly a guarantee of a job. Drug testing, which is an idea that's come over from the welfare side, and increasing periods of disqualification. And it's just really frightening that with unemployment so high, we're seeing this very robust pushback on, what ought to be seen as a core program. And I wonder if people could add their thoughts on how to deal with this.
Any thoughts on that?
Okay. I think part of it, Joan, was really when I talked about the solvency issues, and I said, I'm not going to go there. But part of it is driven by you don't have robust trust funds. And so most states have had to borrow to provide benefits. So you're in states having a big debate about where is money going to come from. And as a way of not increasing employer taxes, they're starting to put restrictions on access to unemployment insurance in ways that will it's really more of it's a value statement, and it's a cost-saving measure. And there needs to be, well, I think, I don't know if anybody else does, but having a solvent trust fund, one of the things that happened in our state was we went insolvent in the 1980s, and then there were surtaxes on employers, and so the legislature finally decided in the 90s we needed to come up with a bipartisan plan to make sure that we had a solvent trust fund. Well, once we came up with a trust fund that was solvent, when you don't have high unemployment, when you're at, 4.7%, and you have this pot of money that's sitting there, it looks very, very tempting. So having a solvent trust fund was too tempting in many places, and so the money started being either not added to, tax cuts were put in place. But I think it's been framed somehow as an economic issue as opposed to a safety net program that was put there, a social insurance program that was paid into, that it was something that was there to protect you when you lost a job through no fault of your own and you are actively looking for work. But what's happening is that those unemployed workers are now being, I don't know, just basically cast the same way that AFDC, TANF recipients were. It's the same language that people are using for workers now who've lost their jobs. It's the same rhetoric.
Okay. Why don't we take both questions and then the panel? And if you've got someone in particular you want to direct it to, please do so.
I want to focus in on Mark's comment, which I thought was very interesting, that Larry Summers didn't even contemplate or didn't include in his options government as a direct employer. My understanding is that Harry Hopkins and the FDR administration generally contemplated, although they weren't able to implement it, that unemployment insurance was supposed to be short-term, followed by government as employer of last resort. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when John McCain said the government can't create jobs, and there wasn't a single pundit or Democrat who said, who's been employing you your whole adult life? And in fact, who paid for your college? And I'm wondering if the problem, and it's sort of a mega focus, but it's through all of these panels, that Ronald Reagan was very effective in defining government as the problem, and that no one, and the Democrats have not stood up to try to transform that and show that government actually can employ people and can put the economy back to work. So it's more of a comment than a question.
Okay. Janice.
Janice Gregory, yeah. We have a very large country with a very complex labor market with many pieces that we've been touching on here today. But there's one piece that strikes me that we haven't touched on. And that is the local government, the local Chamber of Commerce, the local Board of Trade. And I think about back in just a couple of quick examples, early 70s when I worked for Texas Congressman from Austin, and he, in concert with the local Chamber, the local Board of Trade, set Austin on a path to become a high-tech center. To diversify the economy away from state government and university, which is basically what it had at that time. I read in the paper recently Pittsburgh is retooling itself. I was close up watching the Toyota plant that decided to locate in Tupelo, Mississippi. It was not by accident. They went after it. The community college was involved. The University of Mississippi, just a few miles down the road, was involved. All of the local governments of all the little towns around there were involved. So I don't know, there's a piece here of local boards of trade, local chambers, local people getting together and going out and crafting jobs, crafting markets where jobs can survive. And I just kind of throw that on the table because I think it's a piece of the puzzle.
Okay. all right, there are two questions, I think, on the table. One is how do we develop a message that government can employ people, especially in an environment in which state and local governments are laying off people who were doing productive work, like teaching your kids or your grandkids. And the second is why can't local partners, as they would say in Europe, the partners, business, labor, and government, get together and develop economic strategies to grow jobs? And I would add to that, is that feasible on a national basis, or would you be robbing Peter to pay Paul? So those two questions, I would say 30 seconds each, but...
Well, I mean, my kind of larger point here is the fundamental problem in the economy is one of demand. Demand, demand, demand. Businesses sitting on trillions of dollars. What we lack is demand. And so, we need the infrastructure spending, we need aid to states and localities, we need public social insurance programs, funded. But ultimately we need to take on this idea that government can act. And what Larry referred to as the defeat of Keynesian economics is simply the kind of academic manifestation, I think, of this. This idea that government is, there was a phase in this crisis, when there was a cover of Newsweek magazine, we're all socialists now, and the cartoon in the New Yorker, someone's chopping off the head of government, and someone's rushing with a declaration, no, now we need it, and that moment seemed to pass, very quickly, unfortunately, but this is, I think, is a fight that is, unavoidable. It's kind of underlies all of the issues people in this room work on.
Arne?
Well, I appreciate the comments. I guess I want to make a couple of closing points. One is that I agree 100% with the idea that we need to change the narrative so that we feel that government should act, but I also think we need to change the narrative so that we have a sense of collective responsibility, not only on the part of government, but also business and labor. And I think getting those kinds of groups together in a values discussion strikes me as really what we need to do. There is a demand side. We've got an economic problem right now, but we also have a fundamental restructuring of the economy and the polity, and so that needs to be addressed. I also very much appreciate Laura's point about the coming together of academics, practitioners, and working this stuff out. And I think it's really the combination of different groups coming together to discuss this that's going to lead to action and progress.
I think I just want to close with one thing that we didn't really talk about, although we touched on it a couple of times. Not only do we have to change the message, but one of the things that was so powerful that FDR said was that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. There is that sense that we can't do anything that's out there now, that we have to turn around, that there has to be that sense of optimism that it is possible to do it. And when I was at the department, I was reading Kirsten Downey's book, The Woman Behind the New Deal, about Frances Perkins. And I would sit there and read that book and think, if she could figure out how to come up with unemployment insurance, I can figure out how to get checks out. And I think that there is that sense that we need to tap into, that there are solutions, and we can come up with the solutions, and that we do have that capacity to solve this problem moving forward.
Well, I think that's a good note on which to end. I would just have to add